In a desert, where the wind seemed to drag not only the sand but also human certainties, a traveler stopped before a mirage. He saw mountains that shimmered, shapes that dissolved, and realized he didn't know if it was he who observed the horizon or if the horizon itself was observing him. That doubt pierced him like an unsettling spark, and perhaps it is that same doubt that now begins to move within you. Our entire life has been built upon a silent separation. Here I am, the subject who sees, and there is the world, the object of my gaze. This division sustains us, organizes us, gives an apparent meaning to experience. But there is a secret hidden at the heart of observation, something that breaks this invisible line and throws us into a radical paradox. Science already whispers this when investigating quantum particles that behave differently when observed. Ancient spirituality always intuited, seeing and being seen are inseparable movements. But what happens when that understanding ceases to be theory and becomes experience? What remains when the observer discovers he was never on the outside? This is the supreme paradox. Perhaps the gaze is not a bridge between two worlds, but the very creation of the world in the instant it opens. The observer is the observed. And it is this enigma we will traverse together, not to explain it, but to inhabit it. The traveler before the mirage discovered that it was not only the landscape that dissolved into vibration. His very identity seemed to waver, as if the act of looking was already a kind of secret participation in what was seen. This intuition, which seems to arise in the desert of consciousness, is not mere fantasy. Physics, in probing the limits of matter, finds the same mystery. Particles that change behavior under human observation. The double-slit experiment is not just a curious fact, but a rupture. For there is not an independent universe waiting to be revealed. There is a universe that responds, that transforms, that bends to the presence of the observer. What we call object loses its solidity. It ceases to be something fixed, inert, waiting for description. In its place, a dynamic field arises, a dance of probabilities that only crystallizes in the act of being perceived. It is as if the entire cosmos were suspended in potentiality until a gaze gave it form. But this gaze is not neutral. It is not transparent. It participates, interferes, molds. The one who observes is not merely a witness, but co-author of the scene. In neuroscience, another enigma arises. What you call reality does not arrive in consciousness as a raw flow of stimuli. Light does not carry colors, only frequencies. Sound does not carry music, only vibrations. It is the brain that converts electrical impulses into landscape, into language, into meaning. What we see is already a translation, a stage carefully built inside the mind. We are not merely before the world, we are always before a version shaped by the observer. The eye is not a window, it is a creative filter. At this point, the first crack appears in the edifice of separation. For if the external world already arrives impregnated with the internal structures of the observer, then where exactly does the object end and the subject begin? This boundary dissolves in the same measure that science and spirituality approach each other. Mystical traditions always intuited this unity. The sage who closes his eyes does not seek to deny the world, but to perceive that what he observes outside also pulses within. The universe is not in front of the eyes. It opens in the same source that sustains the gaze. But there is something even more radical. What if the very consciousness you call yours is not an isolated entity? What if each thought, each perception, is only a wave emerging from a greater ocean? In that case, the act of observing would not be an individual gesture, but the very breath of reality. There would no longer be subject nor object, but only a living field recognizing itself in different forms. This idea may seem abstract, but look at your own experience. You think you are seeing this screen as something external, at a distance. Yet what truly happens is that what we call screen is only a pattern of stimuli interpreted inside your mind. The entire scene of perception takes place in you. Even the notion of outside is constructed by the very consciousness that observes it. The world you see is not found. It is generated at every instant. And then the paradox begins to insinuate itself. If the world is generated by perception, and perception belongs to the world, who is truly the creator? The observer blends with the observed, as if both were faces of the same breath. The subject believes he is deciphering an object, but discovers he is only recognizing himself in another disguise. This realization does not intend to reduce the real to illusion, nor to deny the concrete existence of matter. On the contrary, it reveals that matter and consciousness are not separate. Each stone, each body, each galaxy already includes within itself the gaze that contemplates it. There are not two isolated poles, but a single dance in which gaze and form are born together. The traveler before the mirage sensed this mystery without scientific formulas. He felt that his vision was already part of the landscape, and that the landscape in turn also created him. Perhaps it is exactly this that we call the supreme spiritual paradox. There is no observer and no observed, only the living act of observation reinventing itself at each instant. If the world does not present itself ready, but is created along with the gaze, then every perception is a birth. And a birth is never static. It is movement, vibration, a spark that renews itself without ceasing. The paradox of the observer and the observed reveals itself more clearly when we accept that there is no fixed stage, but a living theater in which each act only happens because someone witnesses it. The show does not exist before the audience, and the audience does not exist without the show. Both emerge together, inseparable. Think of the fire that burns in a torch. It illuminates and consumes at the same time. It is not possible to separate the flame that brightens from the flame that devours. So too is consciousness. It gives form to the world at the same instant it is shaped by it. The observer ignites the object, and the object in turn feeds the observer. This reciprocity is the essence of the paradox. The gaze is never neutral. It is always a flame that illuminates and allows itself to be consumed. Another symbol can be found in the river that flows without choosing its course. The current shapes the bank, and the bank guides the current. It is impossible to decide which came first, because both only exist in relation. The subject who observes and the observed object are like water and stone in eternal dialogue. One endlessly shapes the other. There is no clear line separating creation from creature, but perhaps the paradox gains greater clarity in an intimate experience. Close your eyes for a moment and try to recall the face of a loved one. What you see is not outside before you. It is arising within, woven of memory, emotion, and sensation. Yet in contemplating that inner image, you feel that you are also being seen by it, as if the very face formed of memory had eyes that gaze back at you. The act of remembering is already a form of being remembered. It is in this territory that the paradox expands. The gaze creates and is created. The image is born and returns presence. It is not a poetic game, but direct perception. Life itself only exists in relation. A tree is only a tree because there is someone to recognize it as such, and that someone only knows himself alive because he sees himself reflected in the forms of the tree. There is no isolated subject, no independent object. There is only a dance of recognition. This paradox also manifests in the simplest gestures. Think of the act of breathing. You inhale and the world enters you. You exhale and you return to the world. Where does the body end and the air begin? Where does the air end and the body begin? In truth, there has never been a definitive boundary. Body and atmosphere are parts of the same circulation. In the same way, consciousness and reality are not separate blocks, but interpenetrating currents. The observer is inspired by the world, and the world is inspired by the observer. If the paradox still seems distant, notice something. Even this reading does not happen without you. The words only come alive because someone sees them, feels them, translates them into meaning. But this very process also shapes you. You are not only the reader, you are also being read. Each sentence that passes through your mind writes something in you. In the end, there will be no distinction between the text that touched you and the consciousness that was touched. Both will have become a single landscape. The desert traveler may have known nothing of science or philosophy, but he felt this flow. He realized he could not separate the heat of the sand from the heat arising in his chest. He realized that his thirst was not merely biological, but also a thirst for reality, for meaning. And he understood that his search was not for something external, but for the dissolution of the boundary between the seeker and what is sought. It is in this space that the paradox ceases to be a concept and becomes life. The flame that burns and illuminates, the river that flows and shapes, the breath that unites body and world, all these images point to the same core. There is no isolated observer nor independent object. There is only the dynamic unity of observation, this invisible movement that sustains both what looks and what is looked at. The paradox is not a flaw in logic, it is the very logic of existence. The metaphors of fire, river, and breath point to a unity, but so far perhaps everything still sounds like a play of images. The mind likes to organize symbols, but the paradox is not resolved in symbols. It needs to tear apart the habitual way of seeing. The shock does not happen through logic, but through its dismantling. Until now you believed that the observer and the observed were two poles in constant relation, like bank and current. But what if they are not two? What if the bank had never existed separate from the river? What if gaze and world are the same gesture? This sounds impossible for linear reasoning, because the mind has been trained to think in dualities, inside and outside, me and other, cause and effect. The supreme spiritual paradox breaks this structure. To observe is already to be observed. There are not two movements, but a single flow that recognizes itself. The subject is not standing before reality. It is reality itself looking within. This turn is not theoretical. Try to notice something simple. When looking at a tree, the sensation is that it is out there. But the whole phenomenon of vision happens in you. Shapes, colors, textures project into consciousness. What is seen only exists because a perceptive field opens. Now invert. That same field only exists because something provokes it, something we call tree. Where is the real separation? If you remove consciousness, the tree disappears. If you remove the tree, consciousness also loses that content. Both collapse together. The paradox proves cruel to logic because it destroys the security of being in control. The one who observes is not a fixed entity, but only one side of the scene. There is no privileged position of the one who sees. To see is already to be seen. To think is already to be thought. To exist is already to be existed. The observer is dissolved by the very act of observing. It is here that the mind resists. It seeks support in known categories. Then everything is illusion. Then nothing is real. But these questions still arise from the desire to separate, to place reality on one side and illusion on the other. The paradox allows no escape to either side. It demands surrender, neither merely subjective nor merely objective. Both are masks of the same force. This force cannot be contained in words, but it can be felt. It is present in the sudden sensation of being pierced by a sunset, in the experience of forgetting oneself when listening to music, in the instant when another person's gaze seems to penetrate beyond the surface. In these situations, there is no subject or object. There is only living intensity, consciousness recognizing itself in forms. The desert traveler before the mirage experienced this rupture. He no longer knew if it was the horizon dissolving or if it was his very identity dissolving in the hot air. This uncertainty was not failure, it was revelation. What he saw was the paradox itself in living flesh. There is no one who observes separate from what is observed. The desert saw him as much as he saw the desert. This is the turn that disarms any search. The path is not before you, because you and the path are the same. There is no one who walks, and that which is walked. There is only the experience happening. The observer and the observed are a single act, and this act is reality itself expressing itself. If this thought touched something in you, allow it to expand. Like this video to affirm this remembrance, and in the comments write, "The real observes me." This phrase is not an empty ritual, but a symbolic seal, a way of recording that you too have sensed this paradox. If the mind hesitates before the paradox, the heart understands through stories. Since the earliest times, myths were created not to explain, but to make one feel. And perhaps a narrative can translate what logic cannot reach. It is said that in a village forgotten by time, there was an old man who never spoke much. His silence was not empty, but so dense that everyone sought in it a sign. One day, a young man approached and asked, "Master, I want to know the essence of the real. Where should I look to find it?" The old man, without answering, handed him a mirror of polished metal. The young man, confused, saw only his own face reflected. "This cannot be all," he protested. The old man said nothing. Restless, the young man departed. He walked through mountains, seas, and deserts. He looked at stars, animals, and cities. He always carried the mirror with him, but avoided looking at it, believing the answer was outside. For years, he believed that each new landscape would be the key to the enigma. But the more he looked, the more he felt that something was also observing him. The forest seemed to follow him with invisible eyes. The waves of the sea returned his gaze as if they had their own consciousness. Even the wind, as it blew, seemed to call his name. Exhausted from searching, the young man returned to the village. The old man still awaited him in the same place. Without words, he pointed again to the mirror. This time, the young man did not see only his image. He perceived that the reflection was made of the very landscapes he had seen along the way. The brightness of the stars was in his eyes, the strength of the mountain in his bones, the fluidity of the river in his blood. The mirror did not show an isolated face, but the sum of the entire world. The observer was the observed. The legend ends without an explicit answer, because there is no conclusion that can satisfy the mind. But there is a vibrant silence that accompanies the one who listens, as if every detail of daily life began to look back. This story echoes something deep. The paradox is not a distant concept, but an archetypal experience that has always been present. In every culture we find similar images: the god who creates the universe by contemplating himself, the hero who discovers he is part of the very labyrinth he tries to overcome, the goddess who recognizes herself in all forms of creation. The myth only clothes in symbols what already pulses in experience. Seeing and being seen are movements of a single reality. The old man of the tale did not explain, because to explain would be to reduce. He offered an object that did not bring ready-made answers, but revealed the question in its depth. The young man needed to traverse the world to understand that the reflection was never about his individuality, but about the inseparability between him and all that exists. The mirror, here not as a repeated metaphor but as an ancestral symbol, did not show a boundary but the absence of it. Perhaps you too have felt this in an unexpected way, when looking into someone's eyes and realizing you were not only looking but also being looked at, or when contemplating the sea and sensing that the horizon was also breathing within you. These moments are glimpses of the same paradox that the myth delivers to us. The desert traveler and the young man with the mirror are the same figure, the one who discovers that there are no two sides in the experience, that every landscape is, at the same time, internal and external, that the line between subject and object is an invention of the mind but not of the real. The story remains open because the paradox cannot be closed. The mirror of the legend did not return a face, it returned the entire cosmos. And perhaps every gaze you cast upon the world is also an opportunity to see this hidden unity. After all, to observe is not a unilateral act, it is always an encounter, and every encounter reveals that the observer was never separate from the observed. The myth of the young man and the mirror does not end in words. It asks for continuity in the one who listens, asks that each person make of the body and mind a living laboratory of this discovery. The paradox is not understood, it is lived. And for this to happen, a simple gesture is necessary, a shift of attention. Close your eyes for a few moments, allow the environment to continue existing, but without needing to describe it. Notice the breath that comes in and out effortlessly. The air touches your skin but also passes through you, becoming part of you. Already here, separation dissolves. What seemed external becomes internal, and what seemed internal returns to the world. Now direct the gaze of the mind to the very sensation of being conscious, not to the thoughts that appear, not to the memories, but to that silent presence that sustains everything. Ask yourself, who is it that observes? Try to find that center that looks. You will notice something surprising. There is no fixed point. Attention spreads, shifts, opens. The observer escapes being located. Remain in this space and see what happens. The sounds around you arise within consciousness. and yet they seem to come from outside. The images that spring up within the mind also appear inside, but have the same quality of reality. Where is the boundary between external sound and internal image? Both present themselves in the same field. The stage of experience knows no walls. Now, perceive yourself being perceived, not as an idea, but as a sensation, as if silence itself had eyes. It is possible to feel that the consciousness that looks also returns the gaze to you. It is like being at the center of an invisible sphere in which every point around you also contemplates you. In this instant, the paradox ceases to be theory. You observe and are observed simultaneously. If thoughts arise, do not fight against them. Notice that even they are seen, and in being seen, they reveal that the act of seeing does not belong only to an eye, but to the very field of consciousness. The thought is born and disappears, but perception continues. The observer is not someone, it is the very act of observing. Allow this understanding to take root in the body. Feel the heartbeat, the warmth of the hands, the pressure of the feet on the floor. Each sensation is perceived, but at the same time gives form to the one who perceives. You only know that you exist because sensations and perceptions confirm your presence. There is no subject without object, no object without subject. There is only experience happening. Now slowly open your eyes and look around. Notice any detail, a color, a texture, a light. Perceive that this detail is not only out there, it is formed within your consciousness, in the same space in which you recognize yourself as someone looking. You see the scene, but you are also seen by it. This exercise is not a conclusion, but an opening. It does not offer definitive answers, but places you inside the question. The supreme spiritual paradox does not ask for solution, it asks for intimacy. Every breath, every gaze, every sound can be a doorway to this recognition. The observer is the observed, always has been, always will be. Upon opening your eyes again, after the practice, something changes subtly. The world is no longer before you as an inert object. It pulses, as if it were breathing along with your own presence. Each color, each form, each sound is traversed by the same gesture, that of being and being seen at the same time. The paradox no longer needs to be understood, because it is already happening now. Perhaps the greatest discovery is this: you were never only the one who observes. What you call I is an expression of the same field that generates the scene. There is no inside and outside, but a single movement repeating itself in multiple faces. The real does not divide itself into the one who looks and what is looked at. It continuously recognizes itself, as if each perception were a wave returning to the ocean from which it was born. The desert traveler, the young man before the mirror, you before this screen, all are expressions of the same enigma. Life does not allow itself to be deciphered, but it allows itself to be felt, and feeling is enough. The supreme spiritual paradox does not ask for resolution, it asks for surrender. Do not conclude, just breathe. The real is already approaching you. If you have come this far, write in the comments, I and the real are one. I want to see who walked to the end of this journey with me, and if this content resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and like this video, so that we can continue creating together experiences that expand the gaze.